Your best employee may have already quit. They simply have not resigned yet. They are still attending the meetings, still answering emails, meeting the deadlines, still saying, I'm fine, but something has changed. They have stopped challenging weak decisions. They have stopped offering ideas that no one seems to hear anymore. They have stopped warning you about problems leadership continues to avoid. And many senior leaders misread that silence as stability. They think things like the conflict has settled down. Complaints have stopped. Everyone finally seems to be on board. But the absence of complaints does not always mean the culture has improved. Sometimes it means your best people have concluded that telling you the truth is no longer worth the cost. Your best people rarely leave the day they resign. They leave the day they decide their truth no longer matters. That is the quiet exit signal. By the time the resignation reaches your inbox, the real departure may have happened months ago. Today, we are confronting the silent signs that your strongest people are emotionally, intelligently, and relationally leaving your organization before they ever stop showing up. And more importantly, we are going to examine the leadership patterns that may be teaching them to lead quietly. This is not a talent retention issue. It is a leadership risk issue, a culture risk issue, a decision risk, and eventually it becomes a performance risk. Let's talk about it. There is a dangerous assumption operating inside many organizations. If our best people are unhappy, they will tell us. Leaders believe their open door policy will protect them. They believe an engagement survey will reveal the real problem. An exit interview will explain what went wrong. They also believe that high performers will continue raising their hands, offering feedback, and fighting for change. But that is often not what happens. The strongest employees may speak up in the beginning. They may challenge unclear expectations. They may question inconsistent decisions. They may ask for accountability. They may try to protect their teams and identify culture risks before those risks become visible in your performance numbers. But when their concerns are repeatedly minimized, delayed, explained away, or received defensively, something begins to change. They stop trying to help you see. They do not necessarily become disruptive. They become quiet. And quiet may be far more dangerous than anger. Angry employees may still believe change is possible. Frustrated employees may still be emotionally invested. The person bringing the uncomfortable information may be doing so because they care deeply about the organization. The employee who challenges you may still believe in the organization. The employee who has gone silent may have stopped believing in you. When that person stops questioning, contributing, offering solutions, they may have reached a different conclusion. Nothing I say is going to change what happens here. And that is the beginning of the quiet exit. Welcome to Lena Speaks, the podcast where we confront the leadership patterns, cultural risk, and difficult organization truths that most people can see, but very few are willing to name. I'm your host, Lena Morris, founder and CEO of Authentic Encounters. Authentic Encounters is an executive culture and leadership risk advisory. We help CEOs, senior leadership teams, and boards identify the hidden leadership culture and decision-making risks that are slowing performance. Then we help build the human systems required for trust, clarity, courageous accountability, executive alignment, and sustainable performance. Because most organizations do not have a people problem. They have a leadership pattern problem. What leaders repeatedly permit becomes the culture employees are eventually forced to survive. Until those patterns are recognized, named, and changed, organizations will continue to lose good people while convincing themselves that nothing could have been done. This episode is part of the Reckoning series, the series about what leaders must be willing to confront before the consequences make confrontation unavoidable. Today's reckoning is the quiet exit signal. When a high-performing employee resigns, leaders often experience it as a sudden event. They say, I didn't see that coming. She never said she was unhappy. He seemed completely engaged. They had just received a promotion. We thought everything was going well, but the resignation is rarely the beginning of the story. It is usually the final administrative step in a decision that has been forming quietly. Before people leave physically, they often leave in stages. The first they stop trusting. Then they stop speaking candidly. Then they stop volunteering their best thinking, and then they begin protecting their energy. They reduce their emotional investment, and eventually they begin imagining a future somewhere else. A resignation letter is often only the paperwork for the departure that leadership failed to notice months earlier. By the time that employee accepts another position, much of the separation has already occurred. This is why retention cannot be managed through compensation reviews, engagement surveys, appreciation events, or last minute counteroffers. Those tools can be helpful, but they cannot repair a leadership pattern that has repeatedly taught good people that truth is inconvenient, contribution is invisible, accountability is selective, or excellence will only be rewarded with more work. You cannot compensate someone out of a culture that continues to ask them to abandon themselves to survive inside of it. You cannot counteroffer your way out of a broken trust. A counteroffer may change someone's salary. It cannot automatically restore the trust your culture spent years withdrawing. Here's one of the difficult truths about top talent. The people who care the most may also become frustrated first. They see the gaps. They notice when stated values and actual behaviors do not align. They recognize when poor performance is being tolerated. They understand the consequences of unclear leadership. They know when a good decision looks good at the executive level, but creates confusion for everyone else responsible for carrying it out. These employees are not necessarily trying to be difficult. They may be trying to protect the organization from preventable consequences. But leaders can misinterpret their candor. They may label the employee as negative, too intense, not flexible enough, resistant to change, hard to please. They're just not a team player. The leader begins to view the person raising the concern as the concern. Weak leadership often treats the person exposing the problem as though they created the problem. When that happens, often enough, the employee learns a painful lesson. This organization does not want the truth. It wants agreement. And that is when their communication begins to change. Not because the problems disappeared, because they started calculating the personal cost of continuing to name them. One of the earliest warning signs, and it's not necessarily that someone stops working, it's that they stop asking meaningful questions. A highly engaged person might often ask, what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve? How does this decision align with what we told the team last month? What effect will this have on our customers or our employees? Who is accountable for resolving this reoccurring issue? Why are we continuing this process that is clearly not working? Then over time, those questions disappear. They begin asking only what they need to complete the assignment. When is this due? Who should receive it? Is there anything else you need from me? Their questions become transactional because their relationship with the organization has become transactional. They are no longer trying to improve the system. They are simply trying to complete the responsibilities inside it. A leader may interpret this change as cooperation. They may think the employee has become easier to manage, but what the leader may actually be witnessing is the loss of discretionary thinking. The employee is still giving the organization their labor, but they are no longer giving it their imagination. They're no longer leading the organization with their courage. When your best people stop asking better questions, you may have not necessarily gained alignment. You may have lost their investment. For an organization that depends on judgment, innovation, adaptability, and strong decision-making, that can be an expensive loss. Pay attention when the person who used to bring you difficult information suddenly begins telling you everything's fine. When leaders respond defensively to truth, employees learn to edit reality before presenting it. They soften the problem. They leave out details. They avoid naming names. They provide the safest possible version of what is happening. Eventually, they stop bringing the issue all together. This creates a dangerous information gap between senior leadership and the organizational reality. The executive team may believe morale is improving because concerns have decreased, but those concerns may have simply moved underground. They are now being discussed in private messages, in parking lots, in virtual side conversations, at lunch, at home with spouses, and eventually in interviews with other employers. When employees cannot tell the truth in the meeting, the truth will still be told somewhere else. A culture does not become healthy merely because leaders stop hearing complaints. It becomes healthier when people can raise legitimate concerns without fearing retaliation, relational punishment, reputational damage, or being dismissed as the problem. You may ask yourself, have people stopped raising concerns because the concerns were resolved? Or have they stopped because no one longer believes leadership can be trusted with the truth? Those are two different organizational realities. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is what remains after people lose hope that honesty will change anything. Performers usually bring more than the minimum. They anticipate, they prepare, they notice, they solve. They connect information across departments. They identify risks before risks become emergencies. They often even provide value that is difficult to capture in a job description. But when these employees begin quietly exiting, their excellence often turns into compliance. They still perform their work as assigned, but they stop carrying what was never formerly theirs. They stop catching every dropped ball. They stop rescuing dysfunctional systems. They also stop compensating for unclear leadership. They stop staying late to protect deadlines created by poor planning. They stop volunteering for initiatives that leadership refuses to adequately resource. Some leaders call this quiet quitting, but sometimes it's not quitting. Sometimes it is an employee finally refusing to subsidize organizational dysfunction with their health, family time, emotional energy, and unpaid labor. Before you accuse an employee of quiet quitting, ask whether the organization has been quietly taking more than it was ever entitled to receive in the first place. That distinction matters because when leaders diagnose every boundary as disengagement, they completely miss the leadership behavior that made the boundary necessary. A boundary is not always evidence that someone stopped caring. It may be evidence that caring without protection became too costly. Here is a question every CEO and senior leader should be considering. How much of your organization's performance is currently being held together by employees doing work your leadership systems have failed to support? How many people are quietly translating unclear executive decisions for their team? How many are absorbing conflict that leaders refuse to address? Are protecting customers from broken processes? How many are compensating for leaders who avoid accountability? How many are working beyond capacity because someone keeps describing chronic understaffing as a temporary challenge? And what happens when those people decide to stop? This is why the departure of high performer can expose several weaknesses at once. Leaders may say, we didn't know she was doing all of that. Exactly. That's the point. And that is the part of the risk. When an organization depends on invisible sacrifice, one resignation can expose the entire leadership system that was never truly working. When that employee leaves, the organization does not only lose a person, it loses hidden knowledge, informal influence, relational credibility, historical context, customer trust, problem solving capacity, and sometimes the remaining team loses hope because they have just watched what happened to someone they respected. Let me pause here. You may be listening and recognizing your organization and leadership team, or even yourself in this conversation. Perhaps your team is technically functioning, but trust has become thin. People are communicating, but they are no longer being completely candid. Important conversations are being delayed. High performers are exhausted from carrying responsibilities leadership has not clearly addressed. Or perhaps you are the leader who has been carrying everyone else, but you have not had a place to slow down, think honestly, and examine what your leadership patterns are producing. You may not need another motivational message, good people. You may need a protected space to pause, tell the truth, and make a different decision. That's why I created the summer reset rooms. These are not passive webinars or generic online trainings. They are live, facilitated virtual sessions held on Zoom. They are designed to help you interrupt the patterns keeping you stuck and begin healthier, clearer and more intentional decisions. The Leadership Reset Room meets live on Zoom every Tuesday from 12:05 to 12:55 p.m. Eastern Time. This room is for leaders navigating pressure, complexity, people challenges, unclear expectation, or the exhaustion of constantly being the person everyone depends on. We examine the leadership patterns underneath the visible problem so you can lead with greater clarity, emotional steadiness, and intention. You cannot lead clearly when you have no place to think honestly. Then we have the Relationship Reset Room. It meets live on Zoom every Thursday from 7:30 to 8:20 p.m. Eastern Time. This room is for people navigating communication breakdowns, boundaries, disconnection, reoccurring conflict, unmet expectation, or relationship patterns that keep producing the same painful outcomes. The patterns you refuse to interrupt will continue introducing itself through different people and different situations. Both the summer reset rooms are happening live through the first week of August. You do not need more advice sitting unread in your inbox. You need a room where you can pause, tell the truth about what's happening, and begin making a different decision. Visit AuthenticEncountersLLC.com to reserve your place. Now let's return to the quiet exit signal. Leaders miss quiet exits for several reasons. One reason is that leaders tend to pay attention to visible disruption. A missed deadline gets attention. Conflict gets attention. Formal complaints, resignations, but gradual emotional withdrawal can be difficult to measure. The employee may still appear productive. They may still be pleasant. They may continue receiving positive performance reviews. High performers are often capable of maintaining external excellence long after their internal commitment has changed. High performers can hide disengagement because capable people often continue producing long after they have stopped believing. Another reason leaders miss the signal is because silence can feel relieving. A leader may have experienced an employee's question as challenging. When the employee stops questioning, the leader feels less resistance. They think meetings become easier, decisions move faster, there is less visible tension. But ease is not always evidence of alignment. Sometimes the meeting became easier because the most thoughtful person in the room decided it was no longer safe or useful to participate anymore. A quieter meeting is not always a healthier meeting. Sometimes the wisest person in the room has simply stopped trying. Be careful when unanimous agreement arrives too quickly. When the person who once offered a different perspective suddenly agrees with everything. Be careful when your meetings become more peaceful while your strongest thinkers become less present. You may not have created alignment. You may have created surrender. Compliance can look like alignment when leaders are more committed to the agreement than they are the truth. Organizations frequently ask for honesty at the exact moment the employee has the least reason to provide it. Think about that. For months or even years, the employee may have attempted to raise concerns. Perhaps they were told, this is just how it works in this industry. You need to be more patient. We will revisit that in the next quarter. You're taking things too personally. Everyone is under pressure. This is not the conversation we need to have right now. Then once the employee resigns, someone schedules an exit interview and asks, please be completely honest. Why are you leaving? But honesty requires truth. You cannot repeatedly dismiss someone's truth and then expect complete honesty during their exit interview. Many departing employees will give you professionally acceptable answers. They received a better opportunity. They are ready for more growth. The timing is right. They want a short commute. They need more flexibility. Those factors may be true, but they may not be telling you the entire truth. The deeper truth may be, I became tired of explaining what leadership refused to confront. I stopped believing accountability would ever be applied consistently. I no longer trusted the decisions being made. I was carrying responsibilities no one acknowledged. I could not continue sacrificing my health to protect this organization from its own patterns. That information may never appear neatly in your turnover report, but it travels through your reputation. Former employees share their experiences. Current employees watch how the people are treated. Candidates research your culture. Your strongest people compare what leaders say with what leaders consistently permit. Your employer brand is not what your organization says about itself. It's what your former employees can say without needing a script. Culture is always communicating, even when the executive team is not listening. Quiet exit signal is not merely an employee satisfaction issue. It affects organizational performance. When good people stop sharing difficult information, leaders make decisions with incomplete data. When employees stop challenging assumptions, weak strategies remain untested. When cross-functional trust deteriorates, execution slows. When accountability becomes inconsistent, resentment grows. When high performers quietly reduce their contributions, leaders often distribute more work to the same dependable employees who remain. That increases burnout. It also increases the likelihood of additional departures. The organization then enters a cycle. A value person leaves, their responsibilities are divided among the strongest remaining employees. Those employees become overloaded. Leadership promises the situation is temporary. The replacement processes take longer than expected. The team normalizes operating short staff. Another high performer begins looking elsewhere. Then the leader says, people just don't want to work anymore. But sometimes people do want to work. They simply no longer want to work inside of the system that repeatedly consumes commitment without protecting the people who provide it. People are not always leaving the work. Sometimes they're leaving the conditions leadership keeps asking them to tolerate. Turnover is not always a recruiting issue. Sometimes it's a delayed leadership consequence. Retention problems are not often leadership pattern problems arriving with a resignation date. Most organizations do not have a people problem. They have a leadership pattern problem. The turnover may be the visible result, but underneath it may be patterns such as avoiding difficult conversations until the consequences become unavoidable, promoting technically competent people who have not learned how to lead others, allowing high performers to carry chronic underperformance, communicating decisions without explaining the reasoning or intended outcome, asking employees for feedback without demonstrating what happens after the feedback is received, rewarding urgency while neglecting planning, confusing employees' compliance with organizational trust, protecting certain leaders from accountability because they produce strong numbers, expecting exhausted employees to demonstrate resilience rather than addressing what keeps exhausting them. Resilience should never become leadership's excuse for refusing to repair an unhealthy system. These patterns do not remain isolated. They become systems. Once a leadership pattern becomes systematic, an individual manager may not be able to repair it alone. That is why the work must eventually reach the senior leadership team and, when necessary, the board. The question is no longer, how do we convince employees to stay? The better question is, what are people experiencing here that makes leaving safer, healthier, and more hopeful than staying? Do not only ask why people are leaving, ask what your culture has made them believe will never change. The question requires courage. It also requires leaders to move beyond explanation and examine impact. You may not have intended to create a culture where people stop speaking honestly, but intention does not erase impact. You may not have intended to overload your strongest employees, but good intentions do not restore their capacity. You may not have intended to reward silence, but if people receive more relational safety for agreeing than for telling the truth, silence will become one of the strongest culture norms. Culture is not defined by what leaders intended. It is defined by what employees repeatedly experience. I'm not going to give you an oversimplified checklist and suggest that every quiet employee is preparing to resign. People have different communication styles. They experience personal circumstances that may temporarily affect their energy. Not every behavioral change indicates disengagement, but leaders should become curious when they observe consistent patterns of change. Pay attention when a previously engaged employee stops offering ideas, stops challenging assumptions, and stops asking strategic questions. And pay attention when they withdraw from relationships they once valued. When they start using language such as you, they, or the company instead of we, or delivers consistently good work while removing nearly every sign of emotional investment. Do not respond by interrogating the employee. Don't suddenly call them in asking for a meeting and say things like, or ask questions like, are you planning to leave? That will not create trust. Instead, begin by examining the environment. What has changed? What has the employee attempted to communicate previously? How did leadership respond? Where were commitments made but not kept? What responsibilities have quietly accumulated around the person? What conflict, inconsistency, or leadership behavior may have been taught to them through withdrawal? Before asking employees to be more honest, ask whether leadership has made honesty safe. One of the fastest ways to accelerate a quiet exit is to invite honesty and then punish the person who provides it. Punishment is not always formal. Sometimes it looks like defensiveness, withdrawal, coldness, exclusion from further conversations, questioning the employee's loyalty, explaining away every example, becoming more concerned about the employee's tone than the leadership behavior they're describing. When leaders focus more on the employee's tone than the truth being revealed, the culture learns to protect comfort instead of performance. Employees notice what happens to truth tellers. They notice whose careers advance and whose do not. They also know when accountability applies differently depending on title, tenure, relationships, or revenue contribution. That observation teaches everyone else how honest they can afford to be. Every time leadership punishes honesty, the entire organization receives the message. Before asking employees to tell the truth, ask yourself, can I hear information that challenges my view of myself? Can our executive team receive feedback without immediately preparing a defense? Can we distinguish between discomfort and disrespect? Are we willing to investigate patterns, even those patterns that involve someone powerful? If the honest answer is no, another survey will not solve the problem. More questions without credible action may deepen cynicism. Feedback without visible follow-through does not build trust. It teaches employees that participation is performative. Organizations sometimes calculate turnover as though every department carries the same costs. But the loss of a deeply trusted, highly capable employee can create consequences extending far beyond replacing a position. When that person leaves, others may begin reconsidering their own futures. The departure can function as confirmation. Maybe the problems we have been noticing are not going to change. Maybe leadership does not understand what's happening. Maybe staying here is no longer the wise decision. One resignation can become permission for others to imagine leaving. This is especially true when the departing person was someone employees trusted more than the formal leadership. When employees trust the informal leader more than the leadership team, that person's departure becomes an organizational warning. The organization may replace the role, but replacing the relationship is different. Replacing credibility, institutional memory, replacing the person who knew how to navigate every unwritten process, all of that is different. If leadership does not understand why the person truly left, it may recruit someone new into the same conditions. The organization fills the vacancy without correcting the environment. 6 months later, leaders are confused when the new employee begins showing the same signs. Different person, same pattern. That is not a recruiting failure. That is an organizational system producing exactly what it was designed to produce. When different employees keep experiencing the same problem, stop diagnosing people and start examining your system. I want to leave you with several questions. Do not answer them quickly and do not answer them based only on what you hope is true. Ask, who used to challenge us but has recently become quiet? Which employees are carrying responsibilities we never formally acknowledged? Whose commitment have we mistaken for unlimited capacity? What truth has our executive team repeatedly heard but failed to act on? Who has become easier to manage because they have stopped believing their contribution will matter? Which leaders' behaviors are we asking everyone else to work around? And if our best people could speak without consequence, what would they tell us about working here? The greatest threat to leadership is not always what employees are saying. It may be what they have decided to no longer say. These questions are not designed to create shame. They are designed to create awareness, because the purpose of reckoning is not condemnation. It is interruption. It is the moment when a leader decides we will no longer continue normalizing a pattern simply because we have survived it so far. A leadership reckoning begins when survival is no longer accepted as evidence that the system is healthy. At Authentic Encounters, we help executive teams identify the patterns they have normalized, name the risk they have avoided, and build the leadership systems required for healthier cultures, better decisions, and sustainable performance. That work is deeper than delivering another training session. It requires leaders to understand how decisions, communication, behavior, accountability, and trust are interacting across the organization. It requires the courage to see what the culture has been communicating, and it requires a willingness to act before the quiet exit becomes another resignation. The most expensive leadership problems are often the ones everyone has learned to work around instead of confronting. If you are a CEO, executive leader, or board member noticing increased turnover, declining trust, communication breakdowns, leadership inconsistency, or quiet disengagement among the strongest people, don't wait until another resignation forces the conversation. Visit Authentic Encounters LLC to learn more about the executive advisory, culture transformation, strategic facilitation, executive coaching services we offer. Follow Lena Speaks the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe on YouTube, leave a review, and share this conversation with somebody responsible for leadership culture, trust, and organizational performance. Because your best employee's resignation should not be the first signal that something is wrong. Sometimes the loudest warning inside an organization is the silence of the people who once cared enough to speak. I'm Lena Morris. This is Lena Speaks, the podcast. Until next time, lead authentically and pay attention to the silence.